There are people who take hundreds of photos of themselves and never post a single one, not because they dislike their appearance, but because something inside them quietly says, this moment is too personal to release into the world. What if this silence isn't insecurity at all, but a deeper form of emotional intelligence most people misunderstand completely? If you have ever taken a picture, liked it, and still couldn't bring yourself to share it, stay with this, because what you are about to understand may completely change how you see yourself. There's a photo sitting in your camera roll right now. You know exactly which one it is. Maybe it was taken on a good day, when the light fell in just the right way and everything felt effortless for a moment. You were laughing without forcing it. Someone captured you in a way that felt natural, unplanned, and real. And when you looked at it later, you didn't just scroll past it. You paused, you looked again. Something about it felt honest, like it reflected a version of you that actually exists, not one shaped by pressure or performance. And in that quiet moment, you thought, yes, that one is real. That one is me. But then, almost immediately, you did nothing with it. You didn't post it, not even close. Something inside you stepped in before the idea could fully form, like a hand reaching toward a door and stopping just before contact. It wasn't a loud decision. It didn't feel like fear in the usual sense. It felt more like a silent withdrawal, a natural turning inward that happened before words could explain it. And what makes this even more interesting is that it's not really about appearance in the way most people assume. It's not about thinking you don't look good enough. It's not about being afraid of criticism in the obvious surface level sense. Something deeper is happening underneath that reaction, something quieter and more automatic. It's not vanity, and it's not simple insecurity either. It's a kind of internal boundary that activates before conscious thought fully catches up. Most people never pause long enough to question it. They assume posting or not posting is just preference, personality, or confidence level. But for a certain group of people, that decision is tied to something far more complex than choice alone. It is tied to how the mind processes being seen, felt, and interpreted by others, even strangers. And that internal process often remains unnamed, even though it quietly shapes behavior in a very consistent way across time. My name is Dr. Marcus Reed, and for more than a decade, I've been studying how emotional sensitivity interacts with perception, attention, and the nervous system in social environments. My work is focused on people who experience emotional and sensory information more deeply than average, often described as highly sensitive individuals.
These are people whose inner experience of the world is not just richer, but more layered, more detailed, and more continuously active. I have worked alongside clinicians, researchers, and thousands of individuals who consistently report a similar pattern. They notice more, feel more, and process more than what seems to be the norm around them. And across all of those studies, interviews, and observations, one pattern appears again and again without exception. The people who show the highest levels of emotional awareness and internal sensitivity are very often the least interested in posting their own images publicly. This is not random, and it is not simply personality difference. It points toward a deeper mechanism in how certain nervous systems respond to visibility itself. And before going further, it is important to slow down one assumption that tends to appear immediately in discussions like this. People usually divide this behavior into two simple categories.
Either someone is insecure and avoids being seen, or they are extremely private and simply prefer not to share. Those are the two explanations most people default to because they are easy to understand and socially familiar. Psychological discussions about online behavior often stay within those limits, labeling avoidance as anxiety, low self-worth, or attachment difficulty. And yes, in some cases that is accurate. But when we look specifically at individuals with high sensory processing sensitivity, those explanations often fail to capture what is actually happening internally. Something more specific is occurring, something that is less about avoidance and more about depth of processing. The brain is not just reacting emotionally, it is evaluating multiple layers of social consequence, meaning, and internal impact before a decision is even made consciously.
Research by Elaine Aron, who first formally identified sensory processing sensitivity as a measurable trait, describes this as a deeper level of information processing. In simple terms, it means that certain people do not just receive information, they analyze it more thoroughly, more slowly, and more comprehensively before it settles into understanding. This applies not only to emotions, but also to social perception. A conversation, a glance, a photo, or even imagined reactions from others can all trigger extended internal processing loops. What might pass quickly through one person's mind can remain active for much longer in another's, not because they are overthinking, but because their system is built to integrate more detail before reaching resolution. Now place that kind of mind inside the environment of social media. A single photo is never just a photo there.
It becomes a point of contact between the individual and an unknown number of observers, each carrying their own interpretations, assumptions, and emotional responses. That means one image can generate hundreds or even thousands of invisible reactions, none of which are directly controlled or fully understood by the person who posted it. For most people, the brain filters this experience into something manageable. The feedback feels surface level, even if it is emotionally varied. But for someone with high sensitivity, that filtering process does not remain on the surface. It penetrates deeper layers of awareness, where each reaction, each silence, and each interpretation can register more intensely than intended. This is where a subtle but important threshold begins to appear. Before the conscious mind even frames it as a decision, the nervous system has already begun calculating load, not in a logical way, but in a physiological one.
The body starts to anticipate the emotional cost of exposure. It is not thinking in words like, "this is unsafe," but it is still producing a clear response: hesitation, pause, withdrawal. And that moment of withdrawal is often misread from the outside as insecurity or overthinking, when in reality it can be a form of internal regulation. The system is not rejecting visibility because it cannot handle life. It is limiting exposure because it is already processing more than average at baseline. Think about situations where sensory input becomes overwhelming for many people, such as crowded places, loud environments, or spaces filled with constant movement and attention shifts. Most individuals can remain in those environments with mild discomfort or adaptation, but for highly sensitive individuals, those same environments can quickly become mentally and physically draining. The issue is not weakness, it is volume.
There is simply more incoming data being processed at once across emotional, sensory, and cognitive channels. The system reaches saturation faster, and when it does, it naturally looks for ways to reduce input. Avoiding unnecessary exposure becomes a form of balance, not escape. Posting a personal photo online can create a similar kind of saturation, but in a different form. Instead of physical noise or movement, the input becomes social and psychological. Attention, interpretation, reaction, silence, comparison, and imagined judgment all begin to exist at once in the background. Even if nothing negative happens externally, the possibility of multiple interpretations alone can be enough to create internal load. And the sensitive nervous system does not ignore that load. It registers it, processes it, and responds to it before the person consciously rationalizes why they feel hesitant.
This is often the point where the decision not to post is made, not as a dramatic choice, but as a quiet internal conclusion. From the outside, this can look like avoidance or withdrawal, but internally it can feel like clarity, a recognition that not every experience needs to be shared, not every moment needs to be exposed, and not every image needs to enter a space where interpretation multiplies endlessly. For some individuals, especially those who process deeply, the value of a moment is preserved more fully when it is not subjected to external fragmentation. The experience remains intact, not divided into reactions and comparisons. In that sense, the choice not to post is not about absence, but about containment. And this is where understanding begins to shift, because what looks like silence from the outside may actually be a form of internal organization. What looks like reluctance may actually be precision in emotional regulation.
And what looks like disconnection may actually be a different way of maintaining connection to one's own internal experience without external distortion. They became less certain about who they were, less grounded in their internal sense of identity, more reactive to whatever came from the outside, and less able to return to a stable emotional baseline once that external input had passed. For an average person, this experience is uncomfortable but manageable. It creates a sense of confusion, maybe even temporary self-doubt, but it usually resolves over time as attention shifts away. For a highly sensitive empath, however, the impact is far more intense and lingering. It does not simply pass through the system and fade away. It settles, it echoes, and it interferes with the natural stability that the person normally relies on to feel internally coherent. And this is where identity becomes something very different for empaths compared to most people.
Many individuals develop their sense of self through external reference points. They understand who they are through their roles, their relationships, their achievements, and the way others respond to them. Their identity is continuously shaped and reinforced by the feedback they receive from the environment around them. This is not a flaw or weakness. It is a normal and functional way that human identity forms in social beings. People are wired to see themselves through others to some extent, and that external reflection helps create a sense of belonging and structure in the world. But for empaths, especially those with heightened neurological sensitivity, the construction of identity works differently. Their sense of self is not primarily built outward and then internalized. Instead, it is built inward first, through emotional awareness, internal reflection, private perception, and deeply felt personal experience.
Their identity is anchored in how they feel, what they observe internally, and how they interpret life when they are alone with their thoughts. Because of this, external feedback does not simply reinforce who they are, it interacts with it, challenges it, and sometimes even competes with it in ways that feel intrusive or destabilizing rather than supportive. When too much external input enters this system, especially input that is inconsistent, contradictory, or emotionally charged, something subtle begins to shift. The internal structure of identity starts to feel less solid. It is not that the person suddenly loses who they are. It is more like the edges of that identity begin to blur. The quiet confidence that comes from internal knowing starts to feel questioned, not by one clear source, but by many small signals coming from different directions at once. Each signal carries its own interpretation, its own version of meaning, its own implied judgment.
And none of them fully align with the internal experience the empath has of themselves. This creates a kind of internal tension that is difficult to explain to someone who does not experience it. On one side, there is the lived inner reality, the emotional truth that feels consistent and familiar. On the other side, there is the external reflection, fragmented into multiple perspectives, none of which fully capture the whole picture. And because the empath processes emotional and social information more deeply than average, both layers are taken seriously, both are felt, both are processed, and the mind tries continuously to reconcile them. This is where what can be called an identity preservation instinct begins to appear. It is not a conscious strategy. It is not something the person decides to do. It is a protective response that develops over time as the system recognizes that too much external interpretation of the self leads to internal instability.
The instinct is simple in structure, but powerful in effect. It pushes the person to limit unnecessary exposure to environments where their identity can be fragmented, distorted, or overwritten by external perspectives that do not fully understand the depth of their internal experience. This is the second layer, deeper than simple discomfort with attention. It is not just about avoiding being seen. In fact, many empaths have a strong desire to be truly seen in an accurate and complete way. What they struggle with is not visibility itself, but fragmented visibility, the kind where only a slice of who they are is exposed, interpreted, and then multiplied into versions that exist independently of their control. A single image, for example, can become many interpretations at once, each one carrying a slightly different emotional meaning, none of which fully represent the whole person behind it.
If you have ever shared something personal online, even something small, and then felt a strange emotional disconnect afterward, even when the feedback was positive, this mechanism may feel familiar. Compliments can sometimes feel oddly misplaced, not because they are negative, but because they are directed at an incomplete version of you. They respond to a surface moment, a visual impression, a limited snapshot of something that in reality is far more complex. And somewhere internally, there is awareness of that gap between the lived experience and the received interpretation. That gap is where discomfort can quietly emerge. Not loud discomfort, not dramatic rejection, but a subtle sense of disalignment. It feels like something is slightly off, even when nothing is objectively wrong. The experience being validated externally does not fully match the experience being lived internally. And over time, the nervous system begins to register this mismatch. It begins to anticipate it.
It begins to protect against it. This is why, for many empaths, the hesitation to post personal images is not about fear of judgment in the traditional sense. It is about the awareness that visibility in a fragmented environment often leads to partial recognition rather than full understanding. And partial recognition can feel strangely disconnecting, even when it is positive. It creates a sense of being reduced to something smaller than what is actually experienced internally. At the same time, there is often a quiet emotional tension underneath this entire process. Because while the system is protecting identity through limitation of exposure, there is still a very human desire to be understood, to be seen clearly, without distortion, to have someone recognize the internal complexity without reducing it to surface interpretation. That desire does not disappear simply because exposure feels costly.
It remains present, often quietly in the background, creating a push and pull between visibility and preservation. This is where the experience becomes emotionally layered. On one hand, there is the protective instinct that limits exposure in order to maintain internal stability. On the other hand, there is the longing for accurate recognition, for being understood in a way that matches internal reality. And both of these forces exist at the same time. Neither cancels the other out. Instead, they create a constant internal balancing process that is not always visible from the outside. So when an empath chooses not to post a photo, what may look like withdrawal is actually the result of multiple overlapping processes working together. It is the nervous system evaluating emotional cost. It is the identity system protecting coherence. It is the brain anticipating fragmented interpretation.
And it is the body responding to patterns it has learned over time about what kinds of exposure feel sustainable and what kinds do not. None of this means the person is disconnected from the world. In many cases, it means the opposite. It means they are highly attuned to it, sometimes more than they can comfortably hold at once. And because of that, they become more selective, not out of rejection of connection, but out of an effort to preserve the quality of the connection they do allow into their life. And that brings us to a deeper question that naturally emerges from all of this. If the system is so precise, so adaptive, and so protective, why does it sometimes feel like something is missing when you choose not to engage in visibility? Why does protection sometimes carry a sense of quiet absence, even when it feels right? That is where the next layer begins to reveal itself. The problem is not the choice itself, but the story that gets attached to it.
The narrative that slowly builds around this deeply intelligent, self-protective, and neurologically grounded behavior begins to label it as something it is not. It gets called weakness. It gets called fear. It gets called avoidance. And over time, it becomes something people think must be fixed, pushed through, or corrected, rather than understood. And when a highly sensitive person starts to believe that narrative, something subtle but very serious begins to happen inside them. They stop trusting their own system. They start to override signals that were actually accurate. They begin to force themselves into levels of exposure that do not match their internal capacity, not because they are ready, but because they believe they should be. And that is where the real cost begins, because when you consistently override a nervous system that is designed to process depth, sensitivity, and emotional detail at a higher resolution than average, it does not simply adapt without consequence.
It drains, it fragments, it creates a quiet internal fatigue that is difficult to explain to anyone who does not experience the same level of sensitivity. The person may appear more open, more socially engaged, more visible, but internally they are often operating under strain. Not dramatic strain that is immediately obvious, but a slow accumulation of emotional overload that builds over time and reduces their ability to return to a calm, stable internal state. And this leads directly into a deeper layer of the experience. The final piece of this understanding is not just about exposure or identity or emotional absorption, it is about meaning. It is about how the mind interprets the emotional consequences of visibility over time, and how that interpretation begins to shape behavior in ways that feel almost invisible at first. Because what starts as a simple decision about whether or not to post a photo can slowly become something much larger.
It becomes a question of self-trust. It becomes a question of internal safety. And eventually, it becomes a question of whether being seen in a certain way costs more than it gives back. There is a very specific kind of loneliness that comes from this process, and it is not easy to describe in simple terms. It is not the loneliness of being physically alone. It is not even the loneliness of having no one around. It is the loneliness of being visible but not fully understood, of being looked at but not truly met, of existing in spaces where your presence is acknowledged but your internal reality remains unseen. And for highly sensitive individuals, this gap between visibility and understanding can feel more isolating than complete absence. This is why many empaths struggle with the experience of social validation, because what looks like recognition on the surface does not always translate into internal connection. A photo may receive attention, it may receive praise, it may even receive admiration.
But if that attention is directed at a version of the self that feels incomplete or overly simplified, the emotional system does not register it as true belonging. Instead, it registers a kind of mismatch, something that feels close to connection, but not fully aligned with it. And over time, this mismatch can create a quiet emotional fatigue, not because people are doing anything wrong, but because the medium itself is not designed to carry the depth of what the person is actually experiencing internally. Social platforms are structured around visibility, speed, and surface level interpretation. They are not built for sustained emotional understanding. They are not built for layered human presence. They are built for quick perception, quick reaction, and quick movement from one moment to the next.
So, when a highly sensitive person tries to meet a deep internal need for understanding within that kind of environment, the result is often frustration that is difficult to name.
And when they repeatedly encounter surface level reception in contexts where depth is what they actually need, they begin to withdraw not out of rejection, but out of self regulation. This withdrawal is often misunderstood from the outside. It can be labeled as avoidance, disinterest, or even emotional distance. But internally, it is often an attempt to preserve coherence, to maintain a stable sense of self that is not constantly being fragmented into partial interpretations, to protect the internal experience from being repeatedly reduced into simplified external versions. In the end, this is not a story about hiding, and it is not a story about fear. It is a story about awareness, about a nervous system that processes life more deeply, more quietly, and more completely than what is commonly understood. And when that system chooses privacy, it is not always stepping away from connection.
Often, it is choosing a form of connection that feels safer, clearer, and more aligned with inner stability. Not every moment is meant to be shared. Not every experience needs external validation to be real. Some of the most meaningful parts of life exist in spaces that are not performed, not measured, and not interpreted by others. They exist in personal awareness, in memory, and in the quiet understanding of what something meant to you in the moment it happened. And perhaps the most important understanding is this: being seen by many is not the same as being understood. Real connection is not measured by visibility, but by depth, clarity, and emotional truth. When those things are present, even a single relationship can hold more meaning than 1,000 observers ever could. So the question is not whether to be visible or invisible. The real question is whether what you are engaging in respects your internal balance, your emotional capacity, and your sense of self.
When that alignment is present, connection becomes not overwhelming, but grounding. And that is where understanding, in its most real form, begins.